Joe Wright and starring Keira Knightley, Matthew Macfadyen, and Donald Sutherland. Not long ago, I did a review comparing the 1995 miniseries of Pride and Prejudice to the 1940 film, both of which were first-time watches for me. If you haven't seen that video, I hope you'll consider doing so, but in summary, I thought the miniseries was excellent and the 1940 movie was very good, with an excellent performance from Greer Garson as Elizabeth Bennet being the highlight for me. I was aware of this film as well, but even despite not knowing much about it or what general fan reactions were to it, I went in with not very high expectations. As I said in my other video, I thought the miniseries was extremely well done. Well acted, well paced, everything you want when investing 6 hours into a story, and I know I'm not the only one that feels that way. But I watched the trailer for this movie and thought it was going to be the glamorous Hollywood version. Keira Knightley, I like well enough in what I've seen her in, but she didn't really strike me as Elizabeth Bennet material. This is still coming from someone who hasn't read the novel yet, so my knowledge and enjoyment of this character is very biased towards Jennifer Ehle and Greer Garson to a certain extent. So with all that being said, I was very surprised to discover how much I enjoyed this version. It took a little while for me to warm up to it and to all these versions of the characters, but by the end, I thought it was great. It can't touch the miniseries, which is probably not a huge shock, but it's a very well-made film that manages to fit in many of the key elements that I thought were so great about the series. And let's talk about Keira Knightley right off the bat. She did seem a little too giddy early on, where I found the other versions I've seen to be much more quiet and measured in their responses to situations and the other characters, even when they're enjoying themselves. But she really grew on me, bringing out the determination and strength of Elizabeth, but also showing that fragility that crops up when scandal affects her family. I read afterwards that she was nominated for an Oscar for this part, and that surprised me too. Not in terms of me thinking her performance wasn't worthy, but just the fact that this doesn't feel like an Oscar-style movie to me. Which sounds dumb, I know. The Academy has awarded period pieces for many years prior to this, but I think I've gotten used to the Oscars mainly focusing on films that the majority of people aren't that interested in, and Pride and Prejudice is so much more accessible. Matthew Macfadyen plays the ever-brooding Mr. Darcy, and with him I think you really get a sense of how hard it is to play a character whose most famous characteristic is brooding. Because try as he might, he just felt like he was moping most of the time in the first couple acts of the film. Moping, brooding, maybe there's a fine line there. With Colin Firth, you always got this almost seething, aristocratic arrogance early on, and Matthew Macfadyen mostly looks a little sad, and like he doesn't want to be there. Which at those balls surrounded by some fairly annoying people, I don't blame him. He can also downplay some of these scenes a little too much, making it harder to tell the difference in his shifting feelings. Later on, he does get to bring out some charm, and he plays that very well. Rosamund Pike, I thought, was perfect casting as Jane, the oft-ballyhooed pretty sister. She's an actress that, to me, is very hit and miss. She can come off as very stiff, but not here. She presents Jane's sweet, innocent nature very well, and plays off Keira Knightley very nicely. That sisterly dynamic is very important to the story, and was missing from the 1940 adaptation, so I'm glad it was played up here. Carey Mulligan made her film debut here as Kitty, and is appropriately giggly and irritating as the character demands. Jenna Malone and Tallulah Riley round out the sisters, and while I don't have a lot to say about their performances, they both do quite well. What's maybe most amazing is, after watching the Blu-ray special features and hearing how wonderfully the 5 actresses got along, it's impressive how they managed to hide that camaraderie they built in order for there to be that separation between Elizabeth and Jane as one allied front, you could say, and the other sisters. Donald Sutherland plays their father, and he was interesting casting. While I don't think his British accent was fantastic and felt a little wobbly, he's otherwise great. He's a much more forceful presence than Benjamin Whitrow. Make no mistake, Benjamin Whitrow is better by all means in the part, but Donald Sutherland brings a different attitude to the same scenes that both actors play. Early on, he's not nearly as antagonistic to his wife, but he thankfully gets the line that I've loved in each version of this story that I've seen.
An unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth.
From this day, you must be a stranger to one of your parents.
Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry me.
Mr. Collins.
And, I will never see you again.
If you do.
The mother is played by Brenda Blethyn, and while she doesn't make quite as big an impression as Alison Steadman did, she's still fine and manages to go overboard at a couple crucial moments. Tom Hollander plays Mr. Collins, and is very meek and awkward, which was a good choice. No need to attempt the uncomfortably creepy character from the miniseries. Rupert Friend plays Mr. Wickham, and is only on screen for 2 or maybe 3 scenes, so he's not around terribly long. Most of the time I was distracted. With his long blonde hair, he looked far too much like Orlando Bloom. And Judi Dench plays Lady Catherine de Bourgh. I liked her in the part, she's very intimidating, but why they gave her that wild hairdo, I'm not sure. It's bordering on Bride of Frankenstein territory. Nothing against the performance, my grievance is with the hairdresser. The movie was directed by Joe Wright in his feature film directorial debut. While I have seen others from his filmography, the one I always remember best is Hannah, a spy-related thriller starring Saoirse Ronan. It's been a while since I've seen it, but I think I could feel the influence of this movie on that one. The staging of certain scenes felt very familiar. There are some nicely edited comedic moments that I have to mention. One is the thunderclap that sounds right after Mrs. Bennet demands Jane ride a horse to visit Mr. Bingley, ensuring she comes down with a cold, and the other is cutting to Jane sneezing on the doorstep after that rainstorm. They are obvious beats to hit, but I enjoyed them. The cinematography was great and is an interesting combination of more traditional, epic filmmaking and very modern feeling handheld work. There are some shots that are just breathtaking. These huge, grand, epic landscapes with wide shots of Pemberley or Elizabeth standing on the edge of a windswept cliff. All of that stuff feels like classical filmmaking techniques. But then for mostly interiors, there is an abundance of snap zooms in and out. It feels very modern and does take you out of the movie, at least it did me, but I still liked it. It has the effect of making you feel like you're watching an episode of The Office or something like that, which again doesn't sound like a compliment for a Jane Austen adaptation, but it gives an interesting sense of immediacy to what we're seeing, and the camera moving about the sets works well. There's at least one extended tracking shot going through a ball that Mr. Bingley has held that feels very indulgent and just like showing off, but it's still impressive. I read that Joe Wright claims to have not watched the miniseries prior to making this film, and that could very well be true, but I'm sure that there were plenty of people on the crew, or producers, or members of the cast that had seen it, and I think you can feel them really trying to do something different with some of those more iconic scenes. For instance, the scene where Mr. Darcy first confesses his love and admiration for Elizabeth, there's a moment where he bursts into a room where she's sitting, and it's staged very much like the scene in the miniseries where that event happens. But then Mrs. Collins gets home and he rushes out. It's almost a false start that feels like it's heading in that direction, but then quickly changes course. The scene where he actually does that is maybe the most Hollywoodized moment in the movie. It's set in perhaps a folly on the estate, with columns all around on the top of a hill during a rainstorm. Felt a lot like The Quiet Man or something along those lines. Both characters are drenched and it feels overdramatic, but otherwise it's well handled. Again, I can't prove that Matthew Macfadyen was purposefully trying to distance himself from Colin Firth's delivery of this dialogue, but it sure feels like it. He almost rushes through the frankly insulting build-up before proposing. This movie is actually much more subtle in terms of the scene where Elizabeth accidentally meets Darcy at Pemberley. In the miniseries, that's the famous moment where she comes across him after having gone for a swim, and all the ladies in the audience swooned. Here, she suddenly sees him observing his sister playing piano. That whole Pemberley section is left out of the 1940 version, which was disappointing to me, so I'm glad that was worked in here. I really like this version of the moment where Elizabeth receives the letter notifying her of Lydia having run off with Mr. Wickham, because of the comedy that is introduced. It's devastating news, obviously, and Elizabeth is pacing from one room to the next, crying while rereading the letter, and then you cut to Mr. Darcy and her aunt and uncle watching her. They're laid out in this wide shot, straight onto the characters, and each time she re-enters the room, Mr. Darcy uncertainly leaps to his feet out of chivalry. It's almost Wes Anderson-like framing, and gives a strange tonal shift to the moment that is very funny. That scene in the miniseries is maybe one of my favorites though, and there it's played completely seriously. I don't believe I mentioned this in my other review, but that scene is so important because it's one of the first times that we see a more obvious sign of Mr. Darcy's love for her, and with him displaying some vulnerability. But it still leaves such ambiguity to his feelings because he rushes out after trying to comfort her. Elizabeth takes this as his trying to get shut of this shameful business, but of course he's setting out to do the ultimate act that cements his true nature in her eyes. The meeting between Lady Catherine and Elizabeth is interesting, since it's set at night. I'm not sure why Lady Catherine would need to rush over it in what seems to be a very late hour, but it's a nicely tense sequence. Following that, Elizabeth and Darcy meeting in the early morning in this misty field is gorgeous. I mention that scene because it looks to have been very difficult to capture perfectly. There's a very limited amount of time where the sun is at that perfect angle to be captured between the two of them, and the shot's beautiful. If this was achieved with artificial light sources or added lens flares later, please don't tell me. I like to pretend this old-fashioned camera work that depends on the natural elements is still alive and well. And finally, the scene where Elizabeth speaks with her father to obtain his blessing on her marriage was wonderful. Both Keira Knightley and Donald Sutherland are excellent in it, both so emotional, and it demonstrates the first time in this movie that we get a sense of the affection and closeness shared by their characters. In the miniseries, that is crucial, as Elizabeth is Mr. Bennet's only ally in the house, the one daughter he can confide in, and her and him. They continually side with one another and share many scenes together as the only allies they dependably have. Well, Elizabeth has Jane as well, but poor Mr. Bennet has no one else. So while I wish that dynamic had been present throughout this movie, that scene is still perfect. The happiness for her and yet sadness at the loss of his daughter from his home is presented beautifully by Donald Sutherland. So, while it's not the definitive Pride and Prejudice adaptation, this film is still very enjoyable. The locations are excellent, shot all over England. The story is told very well, and yes, I know I need to read the novel. On a related note, I've now read Sense and Sensibility, so I'm all ready to dive into those adaptations. If you haven't seen it, I'd highly recommend Pride and Prejudice. Just make sure you watch the miniseries as well, preferably first. Thanks so much for watching my review. If you enjoyed it, please check out some more of my reviews over on Hildebrand Productions. Thanks again, and adios for now.